Hello and welcome to Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and I have the strongest hands and sharpest pocket squares in this whole county. Today, we're going to talk about decriminalizing mushrooms, by which I mean specifically hallucinogenic mushrooms. Nobody's outlawing portobello mushrooms, unless they're GMO, at which point probably some mouth breathers in California are getting bent out of shape. But we're talking about magic mushrooms, which the city of Denver just decriminalized, and Oakland, California will vote on it shortly, which I think is great. You own your body. You do. Your body is not held in trust by the community. It's yours. You own it. More to the point, you are the king of your own garage. That's one of the things I friggin' love about my home state of Oklahoma. A man's garage is sacred. He got arrested for smoking pot. Where? In his garage? It's his garage. He can do whatever the hell he wants. You get a warrant, you stay out of his garage, you pinko commie, boomer sooner. If you want to eat trippy fungus in your own backyard and get mesmerized by the grandeur of Bermuda grass, go for it. We beat King George, and that means you're your own personal monarch. In fact, you are an absolute monarch of your body unless it hurts somebody else. Thanks, the Enlightenment. Now, the savvy listener at this point may ask, fair enough, what about meth or heroin? What if you're cooking meth in your garage and your garage explodes and sets your neighbor's garage ablaze? What if you're shooting heroin in your garage? Kind of hard to casually dabble in heroin. Don't exactly do a taster of heroin and then go read the latest Robert Ludlum novel in your Kindle. Good question. That's a serious issue. Suffice it to say, I think we should treat drug addiction as a medical problem rather than a criminal one, up until someone is actually robbing or hurting someone else. But do you know what's not going to make people burgle their neighbors and get into fistfights or blow up their garage? Hallucinogenic mushrooms. Because there's a categorical difference between hallucinogens, which are non-addictive and kind of Zen-infused, and stuff like cocaine, meth, heroin, or for that matter, alcohol. I would legalize all hallucinogenic drugs today were it in my power, and I believe the downside would mostly be hippies clogging up art museums on weekends. We'll get into all of that momentarily, but first, a word from our sponsor. Something's Off with Andrew Heaton is brought to you by the waterproof guitar from Aquatic Acoustics, which can withstand moisture in a thunderstorm, in your shower, or in the middle of the ocean. You're a mermaid, and you're also a gold digger. You don't just want to crawl out of the ocean, you want to marry a prince. And that means you've got to up your game, what with the lower half of your body being a green mackerel. But try as you may, you can't seem to attract a seafaring prince. You tried hanging out on a rock and singing topless, but you just can't compete with those bitchy sirens on that outcropping of jagged rocks. Whenever you manage to get a prince's attention by crooning Wonderwall, they start rowing over to you only to get distracted by all of those sirens getting into a pillow fight. And then they kill him. You tried playing the accordion, but you just keep attracting polka bands. And while one of the polka bands did ask you out on a date, it's just not what you're looking for. Then you tried learning to play the sousaphone. But for whatever reason, sousaphone music only attracts manatees. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of manatees near your rock, but no princes. Then you tried using drums to attract a prince. But for whatever reason, all that did was anger the manatees who attacked the sirens. So now you've got hundreds of angry manatees and a dozen dead sirens and still no prince. And that's when it hits you. Princes love guitar music. Meghan Markle picked up Prince Harry when he spotted her playing guitar at a folk concert. Kate Middleton seduced Prince William by hiding inside of an oversized guitar and popping out in the palace. Yes, guitars are definitely the way to go. Except, of course, that you live in the ocean, and so all of the water is going to ruin and warp the guitar within a few hours, which is why you order a waterproof guitar from Aquatic Acoustics. Every day you climb onto your rock and start playing guitar music, knowing that eventually a prince will come by, hear your beautiful song, see that you're a topless woman with the lower body of a fish, which bafflingly most princes are really into, and eventually one does. Because 2 months after you take up playing your waterproof guitar, you see a manatee swimming towards you, and he's wearing a crown. "I'm the Prince of Manatees," he says. "Come, beloved, and let us live at my beautiful palace in Orlando, Florida." Wow, good thing you bought a waterproof guitar. Waterproof guitars are the smart way to play guitar when you're out in the literal ocean, on a beach, or in a thunderstorm. The waterproof guitar from Aquatic Acoustics. Play yourself a moist melody. Before we bring on today's guest, it's time for another installment of Travels with Heaton. This week, I want to tell you about my experience at Lake Murray State Park, which is just north of the border of Texas and my beloved home state of Oklahoma. Ah, St. Murray State Park. This sceptered land, this other Eden, this Lake Murray State Park. I felt as though forest nymphs took me by the hand and escorted me into an enchanted fairy kingdom, approximately 2 miles east of I-35. The colors of the trees and water were happy and bright, and at one point, when I was walking between the park office and Buzzard's Roost, the light filtering through the jack oaks to the forest floor radiated a golden aura, as if I had crossed a threshold from my own world onto that of some other, beneath a distant and beguiling sun, where you don't just see light, you wade through it, as if stepping into a warm bath. At one point, I was so overwhelmed by the beauty of Lake Murray State Park and the profound, immense sense of gratitude that I, a mere mortal, had been permitted to visit its splendor, that I literally felt bad when I had to step off the trail to urinate. Because amidst such unspeakable beauty in this forest, this Narnia of Carter County, to void one's bowels seemed like an act of sacrilege. But it wasn't Narnia that I visited at Lake Murray State Park. It was childhood. The immense weight of adulthood that pushes down on us for years, like wet clothes we can never take off. All of that lifted. And I felt a lightness of being I literally had not experienced since elementary school. In the absence of that overwhelming burden of maturity, all the mundane details of life, the schedules, the taxes, the doctor's appointments, the responsibilities, in the absence of all that, I felt wonderment. I marveled at the beauty of the world around me, and I became engrossed in the millions of details and miracles that compose a forest. The same way I could become utterly lost outside when I was 8. My friend and I kicked off our shoes, and we put our feet in the lake, and we watched clouds migrate across an azure sky as if entire mountain ranges could learn to sail. And there, across Lake Murray, I saw the most perfectly green and immaculate lawn, and families there who loved each other, playing on it, just enjoying one another's company. And I thought, I have seen the Elysian fields with my own eyes. I have been to something perfect. And while I had to leave soon, even if I never came back, it's all right. Even if I die, it's fine. It's comforting for me to know that with or without me, this place exists, where trees dance in the wind, where the love and sense of security and the wonder of childhood is unending. And about 10 minutes later, the 3 grams of mushrooms I had eaten with my buddy prior to the hike worked their way out of my system, and we walked back to the parking lot. Whew. I debated whether or not to reveal the psilocybin element of Lake Murray State Park to you. Seems kind of risky. But I think as a broadcaster, I have a responsibility to be honest and forthright as I can, and it's pertinent to what we're talking about today. Furthermore, I have also found that the people who listen to this program are very curious and only really tend to get bent out of shape over 2 things, and that is contempt and misinformation about Star Trek. So I think we're going to be okay, I think. Before we go down the psilocybin wonk hole with Mike Riggs, however, I do want to toss out a couple of caveats. First, in case you're curious, or possibly one of my horrified parents, I have only visited Lake Murray State Park, literally or figuratively, one time, so don't worry. Also, I am aware that there are listeners to this program who are in high school. If you are one of them, please take this advice from good old Laird Uncle Heaton and don't take any brain-altering substances while you're there. Our brains don't finish developing until we're about 23, and I do not think it's at all a good idea to add novel chemicals to them during that boot-up period. And even if that weren't the issue, honestly, I don't think you could really appreciate a mystical experience at Lake Murray State Park until you've been really bogged down in the mundane details of life for at least a decade anyway. For example, when I was in high school, I had amazing nightmares about monsters and getting kidnapped and burglars. Now, at 35, I bolt upright in bed, covered in sweat, because I dreamed I forgot to pay the gas bill. That's adulthood. And it makes you appreciate being able to return to childhood in a way I don't think you could if you're in high school. So trust me, you've got plenty of challenges for your brain for the next 3 years without you doing anything adding to it. Furthermore, in any circumstance, you should of course be careful if you have any type of condition like schizophrenia or you're on a neurological prescription like antidepressants. I don't think I would add anything to my brain under that circumstance. You should know where anything you put in your body comes from. You should trust the source. You should know the dosage, all that stuff. But do you know where? That would be a hell of a lot easier to do. Where it's legal. So you can have someone who knows what they're doing sell it to you. And you can experience it in a safe place. And that place is Denver, which legalized magic mushrooms this month. So let's talk to Mike Riggs about it. My guest today is Mike Riggs. He's an associate editor at Reason and an expert in all of these fun things we've been talking about. Mike, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Heaton.
You're welcome. Mike, before we get into the policy nitty-gritty, which presidential candidates do you think have tried mushrooms? Because I was thinking about that earlier today. I would bet $1,000 Beto O'Rourke has tried mushrooms at some point.
Oh, yeah. I could see O'Rourke having tried them. Maybe Sanders. I mean, I'll be completely honest. I want to believe that none of them have actually tried them, because if they had, they would recognize that running for political office in order to control the lives of 300 plus million people is unhealthy and bad for them as well as for us. And if if the entire field had tried shrooms before and had a good experience with them, I think I would be kind of emotionally devastated.
I see. That is why I think that we should pass a law requiring John Bolton to try mushrooms. I think he should just once a week have kind of a chillax. I think maybe Tulsi Gabbard did at some point. I suspect Andrew Yang is a microdoser, because a lot of those Silicon Valley types are doing that. Yeah. I think he's probably just a little. Right now, everything's just kind of shiny to him, but he's still functional, right? And then I thought about the other people. I don't think Bernie's done. I think Bernie's just been on a steady Metamucil diet for the last 40 years. He just gets up, pours himself Metamucil. I think Biden might very well be on ecstasy at any given time. Like there's been some kind of pharmaceutical mix-up that would explain a lot. And Trump, of course, I think is on Cialis.
Yeah, sure. Cialis for Trump. The MDMA would explain why Biden touches everybody all the time.
Yeah.
And Bernie maybe thought he was trying psilocybin, but ended up with psyllium husk, which also has a silent P up front, which is what Metamucil is.
Yes.
Psyllium husk.
We've sorted all of this. So. We've figured out the drug habits of the 2020 presidential field. Perfect. So
and they're not what you think. Click here.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Thank you. We've now done the obligatory stuff to make the clickbaity headline for the show. Perfect. This is exactly what I wanted to do. So let's talk about what Denver did here recently. They decriminalized magical mushrooms, right?
Yeah. So Denver's ballot initiative that passed earlier this month basically says that arresting people for possession of mushrooms containing psilocybin should be the lowest priority of the Denver Police Department, and that anyone 21 and older can possess them. I don't know. It's pretty murky, to be honest. Like I looked over it again, and I think even if, even if the passage of the referendum means that you're not going to be convicted for possession, I can imagine a scenario in which you still have to take the ride in the back of the squad car and spend, an overnight in a holding cell before they're just like, oh, well, we waited out and we sort of, we talked to the district attorney and this is not something we're going to charge you with. So the nice thing about Denver's marijuana law, well, Colorado's marijuana law writ large is like it's specific.
Right.
And in this case, specificity provides some protection. But on its face, it appears that in Denver, if you are now of drinking age, you can also be of shrooming age.
I wouldn't be worried if you were in Denver, because prior to them decriminalizing mushrooms, I think they'd only actually prosecuted like 6 people in the last 10 years. Like, it seemed to be already a fairly low priority. But the main thing, though, is there is a legal distinction, however subtle, between legalizing something and decriminalizing something, right? Legalizing means it's flat out okay for you to do. There is no legal consequence. Decriminalizing means it's technically illegal, but it is the lowest possible priority for law enforcement, which is to say, until they're done with all the murders and the home burglaries and parking violations and that kind of thing, until they sort that out, you can probably do it as long as you're not bothering anybody. That's the read I got.
Yeah, that's the read I got too. And I think nationwide, police officers don't really care about magic mushrooms or psilocybin. The cases that have made it across the transom and caught my attention have always generally been either the sort of classic person took shrooms and then ran down the street naked or something like that, or some sort of domestic dispute leads police officers to a home where they find, the couple or the occupants have been growing just massive amounts of magic mushrooms. I mean, generally it's just cops don't care. It's not a drug of abuse. People who use them tend to be pretty thoughtful about where and how they're using them, and so you're kind of unlikely to see those people on the road behind the wheel. Mm-hmm. You're definitely not going to find them at a bar fighting people. You're probably not going to hear about them in
I would think that
a sexual assault or something.
If you were to witness a bar fight between people exclusively on mushrooms, it would look like a bunch of sloths trying to gently paw at each other. I cannot imagine a less suspenseful type of fight than on psilocybin. Which, by the way, when you're writing about this, do you tend to? I feel stupid saying magic mushrooms. It sounds weird to me. Is psilocybin generally the term you use when discussing this policy?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's one of those things where people are slowly starting to associate that word psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. I think they're starting to associate those two things. So you can now, magic mushrooms is like shorthand, right? For all the experience and the active compound. But I like to say psilocybin. I like it when we talk about drugs in a sort of
a clinical way.
An adult way.
Yeah, because if I say magic mushrooms, I feel like I'm like a college sophomore that's proselytizing philosophy majors, whereas if I say psilocybin, I feel like I'm actually getting into the medical stuff, which is why I'm intrigued by it. I think that there are a lot of very pertinent medical benefits to some of these psychotropic drugs that I am interested in primarily to alleviate suffering from people that might have some kind of chronic condition, or they might have an addiction or something like that. And it's my understanding, and you would know better than me, but it's my understanding that that's pretty much been cut off to researchers, even in a clinical capacity, for some time now by virtue of being Schedule I drugs.
It's very difficult. There is some research happening in the U.S. Johns Hopkins University has done some psilocybin trials.
Hippies.
Yeah, the hippies at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
The Hefter Research Institute has done some. The trick with researching any Schedule I drug is you have to basically keep it under lock and key. If you're one of these researchers, and this is true for cannabis too, the DEA will come visit your facility and say all right, show us your security protocol, show us your cameras, how long do you keep tapes for, show us the vault, how many people have the code for this, what's your system for administering it. So, with any clinical trial for any drug, whether it's Schedule I or not scheduled at all, to the FDA, you'll present this very long document saying here's where we're going to get the drug, here's how we're going to dose it, all this stuff. And then if you want to do a Schedule I drug, you've got to basically submit another version of that same document, protocols, methodology, all that stuff to the DEA, and the document you're going to submit to the DEA is going to emphasize, security.
See that?
So it's very expensive. It's very difficult. The DEA can say no.
Well, plus you're climbing a very tall hill, because my understanding is that there's drug schedules 1 through 3, I think, and if it's a Schedule 1 drug, what's happened is Uncle Sam has said anything falling into the Schedule 1 category has zero medical benefits in any capacity whatsoever. So you're having to basically convince them to give you permission to do a trial to prove that there are medical benefits for something that legally has no medical benefits. And that strikes me as kind of a catch-22 and a difficult thing to overcome.
Yeah, it's very tricky. You start, I guess, like with a negative base or something. I don't know. You start with one out when you're trying to do Schedule 1 drug research. For any other compound that you would submit to the FDA to say, like, I want to study this, like, the assumption is that it's useless, but not that it's dangerous.
Okay.
Drugs in Schedule 1 are sort of assumed to be dangerous.
Which
and
would be
also
like heroin and meth, but also marijuana, which I believe is still a Schedule 1 drug, even though we've legalized it in a bunch of states.
It is.
Yeah.
And most opioids are actually in Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, along with most amphetamines. I mean, crystal methamphetamine is Schedule 1, but every other version of amphetamines is in Schedule 2 or 3.
Yeah, so were you to take, say, like Adderall, which is an amphetamine, or
Exactly.
has the effects of an amphetamine, that could be Schedule 2.
No, it is an amphetamine.
Yeah, okay. And then like heroin, which is not that different. I mean, it has overlap with morphine, so it does have palliative effects, and so that's Schedule 2?
I think heroin is Schedule 1, and that morphine and all of the other opioids are Schedule 2, except for a few that are 3 and 4, Schedule 3 and 4. It actually goes all the way to Schedule 5.
Okay.
And those are ones that have a very small amount of opioid and maybe have more acetaminophen or something. Like, I think codeine is Schedule 3.
Okay. But mushrooms are Schedule 1. So
yes.
Reason covers this a lot. It's one of the topics that I enjoy reading on Reason, because it seems to me, from my vantage point, that there was some really interesting research that went into this in the 60s. All hallucinogens and psychotropic drugs were just absolutely banned and outlawed here in the United States. But there appears to be a palliative and medical opportunity for things like addiction, or possibly people that are diagnosed with a terminal disease in terms of coping and things like that. What do you see on the horizon that would be of benefit to psilocybin as a medical component, as opposed to just a flat-out ban?
That's a great question. So my shorthand for when I'm talking to people who don't know a lot about medical applications of psychedelics is to be overly simplistic. But the overly simplistic explanation is that psilocybin is great, most likely for depression, and MDMA or ecstasy is probably best for anxiety. And both of them, for the thing that they have in common is they could probably be used to treat addiction, and whether that's addiction to alcohol or opioids or even food. And that's sort of for 3 different reasons. I mean, the addiction application is the theory is that it sort of causes you to think differently in a way that allows you to sort of break neural relationships that cause you to go back to the booze well, for instance, or the food well. And then the idea behind it being a good treatment for depression is arguably the same thing, that it's just like breaking a bunch of mental relationships that you have over the course of your life sort of covered in concrete. And whether you were genetically predisposed to them or not, like the people that we are as adults, we've built that. That is a process that starts in childhood, and you just sort of add and accumulate and cement and weld and all these things. And psychedelics, and this is the thing that I think some people find intimidating about them, is they just sort of allow you to disassemble that scaffolding much more easily than you would if you were just completely sober trying to think your way out of a problem.
Okay. And that sounds good to me in terms of abstract thinking. That makes sense to me on a theoretical level. Is there evidence that psychedelics have been used in a clinical setting to aid people that are alcoholics or have other addictions?
Yeah, so that's actually the first application for psychedelics in the 1950s was for treating alcoholism, and they used LSD for that. And
wasn't the guy that started AA, wasn't he an LSD fan? Am I wrong about that?
Bill, I can't remember Bill's last name. He was into some pretty weird stuff. If you read what he, I think he started as like an Episcopal priest and then sort of, got real deep into some new agey stuff. And if you look into that, I think he probably was into psychedelics. I don't know, Aldous Huxley was. But if you look at what was said in the 50s and 60s, it was kind of a little bit gobbledygook, because like psychedelic research in the 1960s coincided with another very different sort of infusion of Eastern philosophy and like a sort of Great Awakening and counterculture. If you look at more recent research, people are using MRI machines to look at how people's sort of what blood does in the brain. I mean, this is how we measure brain activity, by the way. I don't know if any of your listeners have ever been curious about when somebody gets a brain scan and it's like, well, what are they looking for on a brain scan? They're looking for blood flow because blood is a great proxy for activity anywhere in the body. If you see lots of blood or lots of fluid, like that's activity. Mm-hmm. And so they've done with MRIs with psilocybin, they've seen that parts of the brain that in a fully healthy, functional, average adult that aren't super active when the person is just going about their daily life, you just see all these different spots in the brain like sort of infused with blood, which is, again, proxy for activity when people are on these drugs. So the sort of predominant theory right now, and again, we're limited in our understanding of psychedelics by our limited understanding of consciousness in general. I mean, like nobody really has the answer for like why humans are different from every other mammal. I mean, we know that we're different, but we can't really explain like how we
have wristwatches.
Right? Yeah, we have Apple watches.
Yeah,
why don't
Apple watches
Apple
and
watches?
sitcoms. Dolphins don't have sitcoms.
Yeah. So the prevailing theory, which again, taking into consideration our limited knowledge of why human consciousness works the way it does, is this idea that it wakes up different parts of the brain and it breaks mental relationships so that you can form new ones. And again, like 100 years from now, this theory could be totally wrong. The why could be wrong, but the what is real.
Okay.
The fact that people emerge differently from psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is a very real and I think encouraging phenomenon because it means people who I've struggled. I was diagnosed with depression in adolescence and have dealt with it ever since. And psilocybin was very helpful for me. The research into MDMA for veterans with PTSD, the sort of remission rates are unheard of and incredible. I mean, there is no approved anti-anxiety drug on the market that is doing what MDMA is doing, and there's no antidepressant on the market that can do what psilocybin does.
Well, plus psilocybin, as far as I know, doesn't have any type of addictive component to it. Now, if you have an addictive personality and you could get addicted to, Diet Coke or whatever, you could get addicted to that as well. But in terms of a molecular structure that, bonds with dopamine in order to make you crave it, that's not a thing with psilocybin, the way it is with, say, like caffeine, nicotine, or alcohol.
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't. It doesn't have that effect. It's not habit forming in that way. In a way that MDMA actually is, and I think there are a couple different reasons for that. One of them is that it's not interacting. Psilocybin doesn't interact with dopamine receptors. That's your reward pathway. So your brain releasing dopamine is one of the things that happens when your expectations are met or you get what you want. Mm-hmm. It doesn't do that. It works mostly on serotonin receptors, and even though serotonin makes us feel good, or having more free serotonin makes us feel good, it's not the same as dopamine. I mean,
dopamine is like the sugar rush, like sugar rush, orgasm, all that stuff. It's the like wahoo, arms above head hormone chemical.
Yes.
Whereas serotonin is the like, I just had soup and I'm laying down on my couch with a blanket. Like it's the everything's awesome chemical, I think.
Yes, exactly. And the other reason I think this is true. So the interesting thing is, psilocybin is actually kind of more like salvia, which some of your older listeners are probably not familiar with, or LSD.
Which, by the way, Mike, right now there's basically two groups of people listening to the program. I think there's a group of libertarians that have been following me around since Reason or before, who are eating this up and like raring us to go. And then there's a bunch of very traditional conservatives who are curious, but don't know what we're talking about. And so they probably don't know what salvia is.
Well, yeah. So, let me talk to the older conservatives for a minute. Then, I think another reason that we shouldn't be scared of psilocybin in particular is there's nothing in it biologically that makes you want to do it again that same day, or even the next day. There's no craving. And the other reason I don't think it's a drug of abuse, the social reason, is that being on psilocybin is like work. And it's, I remember I actually went to a conference and I met a man there who was a praise and worship leader at a non-denominational Christian church in the Southeast U.S. A pretty personally conservative guy who nevertheless had used psilocybin-assisted therapy to get through some really rough stuff in his life that happened with his family. And the funny thing was, is we were talking about, and he said that he hasn't been able to talk to a lot of people at his church about it, but if he could tell them anything, he would tell them that this is not necessarily a fun drug. You can have a nice time, but he was like, I did work. I took that and I did work, and I talked to people and I dealt with really tough feelings and really tough emotions, and I confronted myself. And so if that's the kind of experience that you have on psilocybin, either because you're being led towards that kind of experience by the person you're working with, or because you're the kind of person that when your brain just like sort of opens up like a flower, you immediately get to work on talking to yourself and fixing stuff. That's what it feels like. It's sort of exhausting, it's not like alcohol, right? Where alcohol like just sort of like shuts off all this higher reasoning, and you're just like, I'm either here to be incredibly sad, incredibly happy, or fight someone. Psilocybin, it clears your system, and you're like, oh God, I just need to lie down for a minute and sort of let these revelations tumble around in my brain, and I don't want to do this again for months, years.
I'm intrigued by that. Like that's the I am an enthusiast of legalizing hallucinogenics, largely because I think that they have a capacity to help people. That's the primary thing that I'm interested in, or beyond that, almost like a sacramental element to them of taking yourself out of your current life and kind of looking at it from a different perspective, but one that's based on introspection. I'm not really, alcohol I view as a fun thing. I don't view hallucinogenics in that same capacity. I think they have a lot of palliative abilities to them. That said, though, if you and I are talking, and I'm putting on my 1950s hat, and so far it sounds to me like Heaton and Mike have been just talking about drugs, and that's horrifying. We should cover, what's the downside to this? You mentioned at the beginning of the interview, the possibility of someone running down the street naked. There are people that have bad trips. Are there, can you overdo it? Can you hurt yourself? Are there people that get into injuries while they're on psilocybin, or is there a dark side to it?
That's interesting. So from like a biological chemical side, there are the biggest concern, if you were to talk to a physician. My wife is a physician, and the biggest thing she and I have always talked about is Serotonin Syndrome, which is a kind of rare disorder in which your body sort of overloads on serotonin, and it can be pretty bad. You're most likely to experience this if you take a depressant that's called an MAOI, and those are sort of older depressants, but for some people they work really well, and so they're still prescribed today. Mm-hmm. So there's a possibility you could have an unpleasant drug interaction that could require additional medical care.
Okay.
And then there's the sort of classic psychedelic freakout, right? Where if you're not being very thoughtful about where you take psilocybin or what context you take it in, you could have a traumatic experience, right? Like something that is not actually, that would not be traumatic to your sober self, like maybe a party or a concert or a movie or something, could become traumatic because you're on psilocybin. And so if you maybe took this drug to have a nice time, you could end up having a bad time, and maybe that bad time stays with you.
Which is why I would like to see it kind of, I would like to see us lean into the medical side of it, because I think that there would be tremendous good if you had someone there with you who was say a psychiatrist that knew the interactions of neurochemicals and knew what you were on and knew, theoretically, if you've got some sort of psychiatric disorder, that may not be good with a particular thing, or it might be, but either way, have a responsible adult in the room that knew what they were doing and also could control the setting and kind of walk you through it. I see a lot of benefit to it.
Yeah, I don't mind disclosing this to your listeners, but I've used psilocybin and I've helped other people use psilocybin, and that would be my number one takeaway from my exposure, which is, paltry compared to the research that's been done at JHU or the research that's been done over decades by a lot of pioneers in the movement. But the presence of a trip, it's called a trip sitter. Mm-hmm. Somebody who is sober and in their right mind and who's looking out for your health and safety when you're under the influence, thinking really hard about the context. What am I doing? Where am I using these? Is this a safe place? Will this still feel like a safe place 5 or 6 hours from now? Because a lot of psychedelics stay in your system for many, many hours. Am I in a good place in my life, like mentally? It's one of the things I think people find kind of appealing about alcohol and maybe even cannabis is they can kind of retreat into it if they're having a bad day or a bad week, or mm-hmm. It's Friday night and this week beat the heck out of me and I just want to go relax. And in moderation, those substances work really good for taking the edge off. Psychedelics don't take the edge off; they sharpen it. So if you finish a week at work in which you're feeling like, gosh, do I like my job? Am I happy with my pay? Can I afford all my expenses? And then you were to take something like psilocybin, like those feelings would feel super intense. You
might just double down and focus on the anxiety, which sounds terrible.
Yeah. And you know what the interesting thing is I know that some people are going to hear what I'm about to say and say, like, that doesn't sound bad enough, right? When people say, when we talk about changing our drug laws and people want to have a mature, responsible, honest conversation about the pros and cons, they generally expect the cons to be like 50-50 with the pros, right?
Like people are jumping out of windows and like attacking neighbors with buzzsaws and things like that.
They feel like you're lying to them if you don't tell them that the cons are as bad as the pros are good. But in this case, I honestly think one of the major cons with psilocybin and psychedelics is that if you succeed in shifting your own paradigm, if you feel stuck or trapped either by the circumstances of your life or by something like depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder, and you find yourself liberated by that, it's sort of a domino effect. People who have epiphanies or revelations as a result of therapy or a religious experience or drug use oftentimes look at their life after that experience and say, I didn't just need to change what was in my head. I need to change what's out here. And so, anybody who's considering this, that's a thing I would seriously think about. Are you ready to make bigger changes in your life as a result of the experience that you might have with psychedelics? Because if you just feel like sort of blah about your situation, you're not thrilled by it, psychedelics may force you to make big changes. And so I know like listeners are going to hear that and be like, that doesn't sound like a real con, but like, I don't know. I could see down the road, learning that people have gotten divorced because they took psilocybin and realized they didn't want to be married or married to this person or in whatever city they're in. So it shifts our emotional and psychological tectonic plates. And for me, that was a good thing. For somebody else, that might be a bad thing. But I could imagine, I think that could be it is definitely a potential consequence.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway on it would be, I think if anybody listening is considering doing something like that, to be very, very thoughtful and very, 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 very considerate of anything you're looking to jump into. I wouldn't recommend anybody do anything just for kicks and giggles. I personally think that's a very bad idea. I would view it as either something that you're working through medically or sacramentally, one of the two. Which is why, again, like I view this as potentially. I wouldn't really like to get to the point where this is just like a thing people do recreationally so much as I would like it to be part of the arsenal that psychiatrists have to help people that might be stuck in some capacity, and that's where I hope this is going to go. I am pleased that Denver has decriminalized it. Oakland is coming up I suspect that they will decriminalize it as well. And I'm hoping that this will be a shift towards opening up what we have at our disposal from a medical perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that is definitely, while I think that lay people, I grew up in the church, and so I have like a profound respect for lay people and the sort of work that they can do for each other. But I definitely think like everybody knows how much ibuprofen to take if they have a shoulder ache, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody, we just have like this sort of base of socially maintained knowledge about a lot of other things in life and how much is too much and how much is not enough. And you can go 5 miles over the speed limit, but you can't go 50 miles over the speed limit. And a lot of that sort of stuff that you pick up because adults are talking to you about it and they're talking to each other about it. We don't have that for a lot of drugs that are currently illegal. So having the medical community sort of leading the way means that what they learn and the protocols they develop and the guidelines and the sort of hard red lines for too much or, that kind of thing, will eventually get that information. And I think that's really good. And in the interim, I think the most important thing to anybody who's curious about this is just like, respect it, respect the power it can have over you, respect the sort of ways in which it can make you vulnerable, and for your older listeners too, I hope that this resonates with them a little bit, because I think that sometimes they see drug culture as like a free-for-all and careless and unthoughtful, but
flappers and jazz.
Yeah, exactly. But the right way to approach this stuff is sort of cautiously and respectfully, but also, to trust that if you do approach it respectfully and cautiously and responsibly, that you can have a profoundly moving and positive experience.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, Mike, we'll go ahead and finish today's interview. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me and talking to the listeners of the program.
Yeah, I'm always happy, man. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Let's do a little bit of listener feedback before we wrap up this episode of Alice Through the Looking Glass. On YouTube, Snaremerner writes, "You kind of sound like Howard Stern if Howard Stern were polite and friendly. I'll take it. Thank you. Also, did you know we sell merch? That's right. If you go to shop.theblaze.com, you can get t-shirts for Jillian's Rooster Removal, Nick's Horseless Diner, Uncle Milton's Caffeinated Crab Dip, Bigfoot for Congress, and of course, my favorite restaurant, Snuffy's off Route 44, where all of the waiters and waitresses deliver your food on horseback. I'm pretty sure if you buy the shirt, I don't actually get a cut of the profit, but if you tweet me a picture of you in it, it will absolutely make my day." On that note, yesterday I sort of half-jokingly threw out the idea that if you took a picture of yourself not wearing a shirt, it would make my day. I had not realized the substantial portion of the show's demographic that's male, nor how many of you fine listeners out there really, really love a good hearty meal. So for those of you that were kind enough to send me topless pictures yesterday, I just want to remind you that vegetables are a balanced part of any diet, and that I should perhaps be a little bit more careful in soliciting naked pictures, not knowing what happens. Anyway, you can watch this whole show on YouTube. If you look for Something's Off with Andrew Heaton, you can see my handsome bearded face, the assortment of suits and pocket squares that I wear, the dead buffalo head we screwed to the wall. Watching Something's Off with Andrew Heaton on your computer or phone is much better than flying into Dallas and then contacting me to come pick you up at the airport and talk about the day's news on the ride. Sure, it might be more fun for you at first, but I have a tendency to get lost and abandon my car whenever I'm driving it, and you don't want to have to walk all the way to my apartment building and sleep at my front door until I come out the next morning, do you? Of course not. So go to YouTube and start watching full episodes. I look like British Prime Minister material, ladies. Remember, you can always tweet me at Mighty Heaton or Facebook me at facebook.com/Mighty Heaton, or even email me by subscribing to my newsletter at mightyheaton.com and just replying when I send it out on Fridays. Finally, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. That helps other people discover this here political orphanage in Denver, Oklahoma, Hutchinson, Kansas, Oakland, and wherever else you can get your podcasts. Thank you and good day.